Each steel jaw was concealed beneath the chilly green river water as the trap line extended. 3 miles up the creek, valley, the winter fur was thick on the beaver pelts in October 1828. In St. Louis, they are worth $6 each. However, those lines were placed by a trapper who would never gather them up. 2 days later, his mutilated and naked body was discovered in his camp. Charred to charcoal, his furs strewn all over the field. He became the 14th trapper to die in the Wind River country during that season. It was always the same pattern. People would go into the beaver solo or in pairs. They set up camp, run their trap lines, and disappear from rich streams. Occasionally, their bodies turned up. At times, they just vanished into the great wilderness, leaving behind only abandoned equipment. Both men and money were being lost by the Rocky Mountain Fur Company. Along the Missouri, at their headquarters, the partners in the company looked over the sobering figures. 32 trappers had entered the springtime mountains. 14 were pronounced deceased. There were 7 more missing. The fur trade's mathematical equation was changing against them. One person going over the reports was Ezekiel Wardom, 32, is a trapper. Born in 1796 in Scotland, Wardom was among the group of young men who came to St. Louis in 1822. Responding to William Ashley's well-known newspaper ad, looking for ambitious young men to climb the River Missouri. In contrast to the majority of mountain folks from Virginia or Kentucky, Wardom contributed something unique to the frontier. Young Ezekiel had grown up watching his father, who had worked as a stonemason in Edinburgh. After the Napoleonic Wars, Edinburgh Castle's fortifications were restored. He was aware of defense architecture in a manner not found in other trappers. Wardom had endured 6 years by 1828, years spent in the mountains. He was proficient in Crow and Shoshone and was familiar with the upper Missouri's beaver streams. Superior than most, and had saved up enough money to clothe himself on his own. However, he also acknowledged what was disclosed in the company's documents. The conventional method of setting up wilderness encampment involved killing men at an unaffordable pace. The typical camp for mountain men was brutally basic. A trapper would locate an area close to water where his horses could graze, light a small fire, and spread his buffalo robe over the floor and rest his firearm next to him. Some constructed unmodern lean-tos from the branches of pine trees. Most just moved camp often and slept under the stars, should remain close to their lines of trap. This strategy was effective when trappers were part of brigades of 50 or more. Men. However, men were driven toward independent operation by the economics of the fur trade. Dozens of trappers had to share the revenues with a company brigade. All he caught was kept by a lone man. There was a huge financial incentive. In a season, a proficient trapper may capture 300 beaver. At $6 a pelt, that amounted to $1,800, which was more than the majority of experienced craftsmen in eastern cities made in 5 years. However, in a rural area where Blackfoot war groups were always on the move, working alone meant sleeping alone. The location of grizzly bears weighed 800 pounds, had no fear of anything, and lived 200 meters away from death was all but guaranteed at the closest fort. Wardom saw that the issue was not bravery. Cowards were not the men who perished in the mountains. They were skilled trappers who were aware of the wilderness. Math was the issue. A man who is sleeping is at risk. A male. He cannot protect his camp and supplies at the same time by monitoring trap lines 12 hours a day. When a guy sleeps alone, he has no one to keep watch over him. Partnership was the conventional answer. 2 men were able to alternative duty for the watch. However, partnerships meant dividing earnings. Regarding the nature of human nature, collaborations frequently ended in disputes about money, the division of labor, or basic personality issues. Following months of seclusion, Wardom spent the winter of 1828-1829 developing an alternative option. He lived in a Crow community near the Yellowstone River that winter rather than in St. Louis, where he was paid for his furs. River. 2 years prior, he had married into the Crow tribe, and he was welcomed by his wife's family. More significantly, the Crow were skilled riders and strategists who had withstood ages of despite being outnumbered in combat with the Blackfoot Confederacy. What Wardom discovered that winter will change the way trappers took a wilderness survival technique. The Crow described their approach to defense. They never set their tent on a flat ground if there was neighboring higher ground. They placed their lodges such that there were several ways out. They continued to, instead of keeping their finest horses in a corral where raiders could crush the entire herd, they tied them directly to lodge poles at night, simultaneously. Above all, they made advantage of early warning systems. the crow imparted knowledge. Learn how to interpret the behavior of animals. Hours before the event, buffalo grew apprehensive and retreated from people. Humans came. Elk grazed in different ways. The calls of birds changed. The wilderness was not quiet. It was talking all the time. A man who mastered the language to be aware of events occurring far away. However, Wardom acknowledged that whereas the crow system worked for mobile camps with 30 to 50 individuals, it wasn't a direct fit for a lone trapper who had to remain in one place for weeks at a time in order to effectively run a trap line. He required something unique, something never attempted before. Wardom in March 1829, with a plan that would subsequently be deemed unrealistic by other trappers, they fled the Crow village. He was on his way to the Upper Green River, where 14 men had perished the year before. He was carrying his typical trapping supplies, including lead and powder, a Hawan rifle, 6 steel traps, and the essential supplies, a tomahawk, and a knife. However, he also had 60 feet of iron wire with him, bought from a St. Louis blacksmith. 12 tiny bells were removed from a collection of objects in a store selling trade products. That didn't seem to make sense for surviving in the outdoors, such as a bag of what seemed like must be herbs that have been dried. When the seasoned trappers watched him leave, they shook their heads. Worm was overburdened, with weight that would make him move more slowly. Every human and animal in the area would be alerted by the noise produced by the wire and bells. Miles to be with him. When the mountains were covered with timber, the wooden posts served no purpose. The herbs served no purpose. Everyone understood that whiskey and a sharp knife for emergency amputations were the only medications a man required in the highlands. However, Wardom knew something they didn't. He had no intention of trapping like they did. He intended to construct something the American wilderness had never seen before, a defensive camp that may function well with just one man without human watchfulness. Wardom traveled by himself with 2 pack horses for 11 days. He arrived at the Upper Green River in early April, when beaver activity was at its peak and cottonwoods were just starting to bud. There were plenty of game and beaver signs all over the place. Additionally, it was exactly where, the season before, 7 trappers had vanished. Wardom scouted for 3 full days before deciding on his location of the camp. This alone set him apart from conventional trappers who usually, when night fell, they set up camp wherever they happened to be. Wardom sought out certain terrain, characteristics that satisfied several needs. 5 miles up a side, he found what he needed. Horse Creek is the name of the creek. An protrusion of natural stone rose roughly 12 feet above the surrounding landscape, creating a rough 30-foot wide semicircle. The rear jammed up against an aspen and pine-covered steep hillside. The creek's bottom was visible from the front, and elk and animals grazed in this natural meadow. 50 feet away, a spring rose out of the rocks, supplying water without trips to the main watercourse are necessary. There were 3 escape routes up the hillside. However, what caused the most trappers would have completely ignored the remarkable location. Thick service berry bushes, choke cherry shrubs, and wild roses encircled the outcropping. These were exactly the kinds of vegetation required by Wardom. He started work on April 18, 1829. 6 full days were needed to complete the task, which would have appalled conventional trappers. 6 construction days equated to 6 days, without deploying trap lines. 6 days without capturing a beaver without making any money. Wardom, however, was not considering the upcoming week. He was considering the upcoming 6 months. Clearing the outcropping's interior was the first task. Brush was removed by Wardom. Created a clear living area by leveling the ground and placing rocks. He constructed a stone hearth against the rear wall, placing it so that, instead of producing a noticeable haze, the smoke would ascend the hillside and disperse among the pines. Column. He used rocks to build a modest stone wall around the front edge, from the creek bed, raising it to a height that would give him protection if he had to fire from behind it. Then he started the real effort, the game-changing invention. Wardom took his wooden stakes and 60 feet of iron wire, and started building what he referred to as his listening web. He pushed stakes into the ground in a broad circle around his camp, with about 20 feet between each one. The bets were placed in the choke cherry and service berry shrubs. Natural cover is imperceptible to onlookers. In light of these stakes, Wardom. The iron wire was suspended exactly 8 inches above the ground. This elevation was crucial. In the daytime, it was too low for a man to see clearly, and it was not possible to see at night, but it was elevated enough that anyone traversing the undergrowth would unavoidably trip and fall on it. The wire was not tightly tensioned by Wardom. Rather, he left it with intentional slack. Wardom fastened his 12 brass bells along the line at various points. Small bells of this type were traded with different tribes by fur companies. Every bell was encased with cloth to muffle it, then fastened with a straightforward loop to the wire. The bells would not ring because of the linen muffling, by the wire being bumped by wind or tiny animals. Only a forceful tug of the cable would cause them to ring, the type of idiot that originated when a human foot suddenly caught on it. The whole perimeter web created a detection zone around Warden's camp, covering an area of around 100 feet in diameter. Anyone coming up would need to cross the wire from any direction. Additionally, Wardom would be alerted by the bells when they did, even if he was dozing off. Wardom, however, didn't stop there. He carried some dried herbs, which he collected from the village of crows, and started destroying them. These were dried wild onion bulbs, and powdered. He had learned from the crow that mashed wild onions produced a potent aroma that people could smell. At low quantities, horses would snort and grow agitated, but their nostrils could not detect them. Worm combined the rendered bear fat and onion powder to make a paste. He applied this paste to the actual wire. The concept was easy. If someone rode up at night, their horse would be the first to smell the onion paste. Observe the wire. The horse might make noise if it hesitated or shied away, or warning the rider that there was a problem. This could stop a surprise strike, or at the very least provide Wardom extra warning seconds. The landscape itself was the last element in Wardom's system. He took note of which routes that offered the simplest way to reach his camp, and that necessitated challenging maneuvering through thick vegetation or over stony terrain. He took no action to change the simple methods. Rather, his wire was thoughtfully placed such that anyone pursuing the quickest paths would undoubtedly come across it. But anyone selecting the challenging paths would create enough noise as they pushed through the undergrowth for the Wardom to hear them approaching nevertheless. And in other words, any potential approach to his camp would result in warnings, either from the bells and wire or from the sound of traversing challenging terrain. Wardom, on April 25, 1829, completed his first trap line and concluded his construction. He placed 6 traps along every morning and evening. They inspect Horse Creek and the main Green River. The work was completed in accordance with the usual format of a mountain guy trapping, wade into frigid water, and dressed in buckskin that would remain damp throughout the day. Locate the beaver's slide and run. Submerge the trap. Attach it with a chain to a stake inserted into the creek bed. Put a stick above the aroma that drew beavers to the trap was castoreum. However, in contrast to conventional Wardom, the trapper went back to the same defensive camp every night. Additionally, every night, knowing that his listening web would notify him if someone approached, he slept well. The system worked. The sound of bells ringing on the north side of Warden's perimeter startled him up on the 11th night. It was roughly 2 a.m., complete darkness, no moon. In less than 3 seconds, he was awake and crouching behind his stone wall, paying attention. After ringing once, the bells had ceased. Someone had comprehended what had happened, tripped the wire, and then froze. There was still worry. Completely motionless, breathing under control, and waiting. 5 minutes went by. Then, at the same spot, the bells chimed once more. The person attempting to pass through the wire was out there. Cautiously, but it was impossible in the dark. A third ring of the bells. This time, there were several rings, indicating that the individual had become caught in the wire and was attempting to untangle themselves. Worm heard agitated, low voices. 2 males at least talking in Blackfoot. They were debating whether to keep on or to stop. The wiring hadn't not only warned Wardom, but it had also warned the advancing war party that they had lost their surprise, and that the camp they were on the horizon might be protected in unexpected ways. The voices grew quieter. The bandits retreated. Wardom stayed up until daybreak, but no one else approached. He checked his perimeter in the morning and discovered footprints from a minimum of 4 northern approaching guys. They had already approached his camp within 60 feet. Striking the wire, they would have stepped right into his sleeping posture if it weren't for the wire. Worm's word by midsummer, survival had spread across the trapping community. Additional trappers who had stayed away from the Green River following the defeats of the previous year, the nation started to realize that Wardom was not only prospering, but survive. He was operating at the summer rendezvous with furs, alone in a rural area where men had died while working in pairs. People started asking questions. What was Wardom up to? In a different way, late June saw the arrival of the first guest, veteran Thomas McKinnon. After working the mountains since 1824, the trapper rode up Horse Creek in quest of the camp of Wardom. In order to prevent being shot, McKinnon called out as he got closer during the day. As a danger, McKinnon's response to seeing Wardham's camp was a mix of doubt and fascination. The fireplace and stone outcropping made sense. The wall of stone was. The wire perimeter seemed adequate, but McKinnon thought it was ridiculous. "You believe will a Blackfoot war group be deterred by wire and bells?" McKinnon inquired. Worm's reaction later on, he became well known among mountain men. "No one needs to be stopped by them. You must wake me up. A man sleeping in his robes is not the same as a man with a rifle in his arms." McKinnon spent 2 days observing the operation of the system at Wardham's camp. He observed that the bells did not ring during the day, even though the meadow was traversed by animals and elk. Without catching the low wire, the animals crossed it. Even in daylight, he saw, the wire was almost undetectable unless you knew where to look. He saw that any trapper might use the materials at their disposal to build the complete perimeter. Nothing unusual or unfeasible acquire. Above all, McKinnon observed that Wardom seemed to be relaxed and be mindful. He was not exhibiting the worn-out fatigue that was typical of men who slept and trappers who worked alone. Terribly, since sleep meant being vulnerable. Wardom was actually sleeping since he was able to sleep with confidence thanks to his listening web. Returning to the summer rendezvous, McKinnon provided specific explanations of the Wardom system. Other trappers' reactions were rather split. Traditional trappers older dismissed it as a complication of eccentricity. Wires and bells were unnecessary for true mountain men. They had a light sleep, and relied on their intuition and past experiences, waking at any sound. However, men who had survived and younger trappers were near calls noticed a change. They saw a system that offered the benefits of partnership, that is, security through warning, without having to divide their earnings. By the end of Wardham's listening web approach had been attempted to be imitated by at least 7 other trappers by 1829. The outcomes differed, according to how closely they adhered to his technique. Wire was strung by 2 trappers, but they positioned it too high at knee level, as opposed to ankle level. Experienced raiders just walked over the higher placement because it was more noticeable. As soon as they saw it, in an attempt to save money, 3 trappers substituted rope for wire. When the rope stretched, pulled, absorbing force and preventing a clear ringing of the bells. 1 trapper set up his wire, but neglected to take drainage and slope into consideration, and a strong downpour caused a runoff that carried his stakes away. However, both of the trappers who adhered strictly to the Wardom system made it through the autumn trapping season, working alone in region where lone trappers had once frequently perished. The evidence was getting harder to disregard. An important turning point occurred during the winter of 1829 to 1830. Wardom went back to he taught his techniques to other trappers who sought him out in Crow Village during the cold months. He conducted what amounted to training sessions, choosing defensive terrain, guiding men through the entire procedure, putting up perimeter wire, turning off bells to avoid false alerts, hiding behind natural flora and combining escape routes, defense positions and the listening web. What came out of these winter sessions was a whole way of thinking about wilderness survival, not just a method. Wardom underlined that the listening web was not a camp's static defense. It served as an early warning system that allowed a defender to react. Planning was necessary for the response itself. Prior to an attack, a man needs to be aware of his escape routes. He required his rifle, powder horn, and other necessary equipment, with the bullet pouch placed for easy access. He needs to work on transitioning from slumber to defensive posture in the dark. Wardom also instructed in the system's psychological component.